The air inside the lecture hall was thick with the scent of coffee and the faint hum of ambition. Students filled every seat, some chatting excitedly, others nervously scrolling through their tablets. It was the first day of medical school, a dream that had taken years of sleepless nights, relentless studying, and unshakable faith for Amina Khan to reach. She sat quietly near the middle row, adjusting her hijab neatly around her face. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from pride. She had done it, against every odd, every skeptical look, every whispered doubt. She was here. Amina had always known that her path would not be easy. Growing up, she had faced questions that cut deeper than curiosity. Why do you wear that? Aren't you hot in that scarf? Do your parents force you? She had learned to smile through it, to keep her focus on the future she was building. But this was different. This was a new chapter, a chance to prove herself on a stage where knowledge and skill, not prejudice, should define her worth. At least, that was what she hoped. The first few weeks of classes went smoothly enough. Amina found solace in anatomy labs, her steady hands tracing the delicate web of life beneath skin and muscle. She often stayed late, reviewing notes, committed to mastering every detail. But beneath the surface, something darker began to stir. Small, cutting remarks that grew sharper with each passing day. It started with whispers. The kind that follow you when you walk into a room. The kind that stop just loud enough for you to know they're about you. And then there was him, Ethan Moore. Confident, charming, and loud. The kind of student who never missed a chance to show off. He was quick with a joke and quicker with judgment. To many, he was popular. To Amina, he became the embodiment of every sneer, every smirk that told her she didn't belong. At first, she tried to ignore it. The way his laughter grew louder when she entered the room. The way he called her Miss Modesty when she volunteered an answer in class. The way his friends snickered when he mimed covering his head with a scarf. It was childish, petty, but it hurt. No matter how strong Amina pretended to be, no one ever truly gets used to humiliation. Especially not in a place where you've worked your whole life to belong. Still, she endured. She told herself that one day, it wouldn't matter. That one day, her skill would silence every whisper. But the human spirit, even the strongest, can only endure so much before it bends beneath the weight of cruelty. One afternoon, during a clinical skills lab, the class was paired for an exercise. Amina's name appeared next to Ethan's on the screen. Her stomach sank. Around them, other students exchanged quick looks, some amused, some pitying. Ethan smirked, as if fate had handed him a private joke. The exercise was simple practice basic suturing on simulated wounds. Amina approached the workstation, her hands steady, her focus sharp. But Ethan seemed intent on turning the session into a performance. He cracked jokes, rolled his eyes, and deliberately cut the suturing thread too short. Each act a quiet provocation. At one point, he leaned over, muttering something under his breath about how someone, like her, would never make it in surgery anyway. The instructor didn't hear. No one did. But Amina did. And in that moment, something inside her changed. It wasn't anger, it was resolve. That night, as rain tapped softly against her dorm window, Amina sat at her desk, eyes red but unyielding. She thought about every woman who had walked into a room and been told she didn't belong. Every girl who had been mocked for her faith, her culture, her voice. She promised herself that she would never give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would rise, quietly, steadily, until her success spoke louder than their cruelty ever could. Months passed, and the semester grew more demanding. Ethan's arrogance only intensified. But so did Amina's determination. She aced her exams, earned quiet nods of respect from professors, and began assisting in student-led medical research. Each achievement was another step, not just toward her dream, but away from their prejudice. Still, Ethan continued his subtle torment. He never faced consequences. He didn't need to. The system rarely punished this kind of discrimination. It hid behind smiles and policies, behind words like misunderstanding and different perspectives. But Amina carried the weight of each insult like a scar beneath her skin. It drove her, shaped her. By the time their final exams came, she was no longer the nervous girl adjusting her hijab in the back of the class. She was focused, fearless, her hands steady as ever, her heart armored by endurance. And then, the results came in. Amina ranked among the top 5 in the class. Ethan barely scraped by. Rumors spread that he had nearly failed a key practical exam. He didn't take it well. One afternoon, she overheard him talking to a group of classmates, blaming quota systems and diversity hires for his poor performance. The words stung not because they were new, but because they were so predictably cruel. Amina didn't confront him. She didn't need to. She just kept walking. She had learned that the most powerful response to hate was to keep rising, to succeed so completely that no one could deny it. But fate wasn't finished yet. Years later, when Amina had nearly forgotten the sting of that first encounter, when her white coat bore the title, Dak Khan, stitched neatly across the pocket, she would find herself standing over a familiar face on an operating table. The years had aged him, humbled him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by fear. And as Amina adjusted her surgical mask, ready to save the very man who once mocked her faith, she realized something profound, that the truest justice doesn't come from revenge, but from grace. But that moment was still far in the future. For now, she was still just a student, one who had learned how cruel the world could be, and how strong she had to become to survive it. And as her second year of medical school began, Amina didn't know that life was already setting the stage for the most ironic twist of all, one that would bring every wound, every insult, every moment of pain full circle, because soon she would be the one holding the scalpel, and he would be the one praying for mercy. The weeks that followed the incident at school felt heavier than any before. Amina carried the sting of humiliation with her wherever she went. Her hijab, once a comforting expression of faith and identity, now felt like a target. The laughter that day, the echo of mockery in the hallway, played in her mind every time she caught her reflection in a mirror. It wasn't just about the words or the laughter. It was about the way people looked at her afterward, like she was different, foreign, less. At first, she tried to hide her pain behind silence. She buried herself in her textbooks, sitting at the back of the class, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when absolutely necessary. But even then, whispers followed her. The boy who had mocked her, Ethan, became something of a hero among some of the students. They laughed behind her back, repeating his words, calling her the girl with the towel, as if her faith was a joke for their amusement. Every lunch period became a small battle. She sat alone, trying to eat in peace while her heart clenched at the sound of stifled giggles and muttered slurs. The teachers did little to help. Most pretended not to notice, their silence becoming a quiet form of approval. It was easier to ignore than to intervene, easier to pretend it wasn't happening. But at home, Amina's mother noticed the change. Her usually bright and focused daughter had become withdrawn. The spark in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by something quieter, sadder, heavier. Amina wanted to tell her everything, to cry into her mother's arms and release the pain she was holding inside. Yet she stayed silent, not wanting to burden her. Her parents had already endured so much to build a life in this new country, working multiple jobs, facing discrimination of their own, and still holding their heads high. So Amina endured. Still, there were moments when she almost broke. During one biology class, the teacher had asked her to present a project. As she stood in front of the class, clutching her notes, she could feel her hands trembling. Before she could even begin, someone from the back snickered, a cruel, mocking laugh that sent heat rushing to her face. It was Ethan again. That moment branded itself into her memory. She felt powerless, humiliated, and invisible, as if her existence was something people could ridicule without consequence. But that day also planted something else deep inside her, a quiet, burning determination. Amina began to study harder than ever. She spent hours in the library after school, not just catching up, but pushing beyond the curriculum. Science fascinated her, the precision of biology, the logic of anatomy, the miracle of the human body. It became her escape, a place where her worth wasn't defined by her accent or her hijab, but by her effort and intellect. Her teachers began to notice her exceptional performance, though few ever said it aloud. But Amina didn't need validation from them anymore. She had found purpose. Her grades soared, and with every exam she aced, she reclaimed a small piece of the self, worth that the world had tried to strip away. Meanwhile, Ethan's popularity grew. He was charming, athletic, and confident, the kind of student teachers favored without realizing their bias. He wore arrogance like a badge, moving through the school with the careless ease of someone who never had to question his place in the world. Amina, on the other hand, walked with quiet dignity, staying invisible yet focused, channeling her pain into ambition. Years began to pass, and Amina's transformation was gradual but powerful. By the time she reached the end of high school, She had built a fortress of resilience around her heart. The laughter no longer pierced as sharply as before. She had learned that people's prejudice said more about them than it ever could about her. When college acceptances arrived, Amina held the letter from the state's top medical program in her trembling hands. It felt surreal. The girl who once sat in silence, mocked for her faith and identity, had earned a place among the brightest minds in medicine. She remembered the long nights of studying, the loneliness, the tears she had cried in secret. Every hardship had been fuel, every insult a stepping stone. As she prepared to leave for college, she packed not just clothes and books, but also memories, both painful and empowering. She carried the memory of that boy's laughter not as a wound, but as a reminder of how far she had come. The world had tried to make her ashamed of who she was, but instead, it had forged her into someone unbreakable. Still, the past had a way of following people, even into new beginnings. In her first semester of medical school, Amina excelled once again. Her hijab was no longer a source of insecurity. It was a part of her strength, her discipline, her grace. Professors admired her work ethic, and classmates respected her intelligence. She was finally seen for who she truly was. But fate has its strange ways of closing circles. One afternoon, as she scrolled through her university's online student forum, a familiar name caught her eye: Ethan Miller, the boy who had mocked her. He was studying business at the same university, just a few buildings away from her lecture halls. Her breath caught for a moment. The memories came rushing back, the laughter, the humiliation, the shame she once carried like a shadow. She hadn't thought of him in years, and now, he was here, walking the same campus grounds as her. Part of her wanted to avoid him entirely, to let the past stay buried. But another part, stronger, bolder, knew that this meeting, however it happened, would be inevitable. As she closed her laptop, Amina felt something shift inside her. The world was round, and people often found themselves face to face with their pasts when they least expected it. Little did she know their paths were about to cross again. This time, not as classmates, but in a place where life and death hung in balance. Years passed, but the memory of that cruel laughter, the mockery of her hijab, the humiliation in the school hallway, never truly faded from Amina's mind. It became the fire beneath every long night of studying, the quiet motivation behind every obstacle she faced. While others doubted her, she carried a certainty that she would prove her worth not through revenge, but through excellence. Medical school was no gentle path. It demanded every ounce of her time, energy, and spirit. Amina spent countless nights in the dimly lit corners of the university library, surrounded by open anatomy books and scribbled notes. Her hijab remained her crown, though many times it made her a target for silent judgment. Professors who hesitated to call on her during discussions, patients who flinched at her presence during clinical rotations. These were the unspoken barriers she faced daily. Yet, she moved forward with grace, never allowing the prejudice to break her. The first time she stepped into the operating room as a medical student, she felt a deep sense of reverence. The sterile smell, the cool air, the hum of machines. It was as if the universe had finally aligned her destiny. Beneath the bright lights, in the rhythm of surgical precision, she found peace. Every incision, every careful stitch, every heartbeat under her observation reminded her of her purpose: to heal, to serve, to rise above hate. Her years in medical school tested her resilience. There were moments of exhaustion, times when she doubted whether she could endure the pressure. But she remembered her father's gentle words, words she had carried with her since that terrible day in school. Your faith is your strength, not your weakness. Each time she looked at her reflection in the mirror before leaving for rounds, she adjusted her hijab with quiet pride, knowing it symbolized not limitation, but conviction. After years of perseverance, Amina graduated at the top of her class. She was one of the few Muslim women in her program, and perhaps the only one who had never compromised her beliefs for acceptance. During the ceremony, as she held her diploma in trembling hands, tears filled her eyes. She wasn't just holding a piece of paper. She was holding proof that resilience could rewrite the stories written in prejudice. Residency was her next test. The long hours, the relentless pressure, the emotional toll. It was enough to break the most determined hearts. She rotated through different departments, earning quiet respect from nurses and colleagues who once underestimated her. Her compassion toward patients, her ability to remain calm under chaos, and her surgical precision began to speak louder than the stereotypes surrounding her. But even in this world of professionals, ignorance still found a way in. Some senior doctors questioned her attire, subtly suggesting that her hijab could be inconvenient in an emergency. Others made her feel invisible, their eyes sliding past her as if her presence didn't matter. Yet Amina had learned to endure silence without surrender. She responded not with confrontation, but with excellence, and slowly the silence shifted. Patients began asking for her by name. Nurses trusted her judgment implicitly. Her fellow residents, once distant, started looking to her for advice. Without ever raising her voice, she commanded respect through action. By her third year of residency, Amina had chosen her specialty, cardiothoracic surgery. It was one of the most challenging and competitive fields in medicine, but to her, it felt like destiny. She had always been drawn to the rhythm of the heart, the very organ that symbolized life, courage, and compassion. Saving a heart felt like reclaiming humanity itself. One evening, after a particularly grueling 14-hour shift, Amina stood in the hospital parking lot, looking up at the night sky. The city lights shimmered, and a soft breeze brushed against her face. She felt exhaustion deep in her bones, but also something else, peace. Every scar of her journey, every insult she had endured, every late night spent studying alone, it had all led her here. Still, there were nights when the past crept in, the laughter, the whispers, the looks that said you don't belong. And though she had forgiven, she could never forget. It wasn't vengeance that stirred within her, but a quiet sense that one day, fate would give her a chance to show what true strength looked like. That chance came sooner than she expected. One cold winter morning, Amina was called into the hospital earlier than usual. A major accident had occurred, multiple casualties, severe trauma cases. As she prepared in the operating room, her heart beat steady beneath the layers of sterile blue. Her team trusted her, followed her lead without question. She had grown into a surgeon others depended on. The first patient was rushed in. A middle-aged man, severely injured, his condition critical. His file landed in Amina's hands. She glanced briefly at the details before focusing on the surgical plan. But then her eyes froze. The name written on the file stirred something deep within her, an echo from the past. The name she thought she'd never see again. Her mind raced as she tried to focus. The years fell away, and she was once again that girl in the school hallway, clutching her books while laughter filled the air. The man on the operating table, the one whose life now rested in her hands, was him. The boy who had mocked her hijab, the boy who had humiliated her in front of everyone. Now, years later, he lay unconscious beneath the surgical lights, vulnerable, dependent, and unaware of the irony fate had crafted. Amina took a deep breath, steadying herself. She could feel the weight of destiny pressing down upon her. The room seemed to grow quieter, the sound of the monitors rhythmic and haunting. In that moment, she realized, life had brought her full circle. And as she looked down at the man who had once mocked her faith, now entrusting his life to her skill, she felt not anger, but clarity, because now the power was hers, not to harm but to heal. Still, as the nurses prepared for surgery, one question lingered in her mind, one that would test her character more than any exam ever had. Would she be able to save the man who once destroyed a part of her spirit? The scalpel gleamed under the lights, and with steady hands, she made the first incision. The answer would come in the next few hours, along with the true test of her faith. Years passed, and with them came layers of growth, scars, and quiet determination. Amina had learned to walk through the world with her head held high, her hijab no longer feeling like a target but a statement, one that declared strength, faith, and resilience. What had once made her a victim now became the source of her power. Medical school tested her in every possible way. The long hours, endless studying, and sleepless nights pushed her limits, but what challenged her most wasn't the workload. It was the silent bias that followed her everywhere. Professors who looked past her raised hand, classmates who spoke over her, patients who flinched at her appearance during rounds. Every time it happened, the memories of high school resurfaced. The laughter, the whispers, the cruel jokes about her hijab. But unlike before, she didn't shrink from it anymore. She turned that pain into purpose. By her third year of medical school, Amina had gained the quiet respect of those around her. Her performance was unmatched. Top of her class in anatomy, precise in surgery labs, and calm under pressure during emergency simulations. Her instructors couldn't deny her brilliance, even if some of them didn't want to admit it. Still, there were moments of loneliness. Those evenings when she would sit by her dorm window, Textbook spread open, but her mind drifting elsewhere. She would think about how hard she'd fought to reach this point, how many times she'd been underestimated, dismissed, or mocked. And she would whisper to herself that she wasn't just doing this for her own future, but for every young woman who was ever made to feel less because of her faith. Then came her residency, the defining years. Amina joined one of the most prestigious hospitals in the city. The corridors were wide and gleaming, filled with people who carried confidence like armor. Yet even here, beneath the white coats and polite smiles, prejudice lingered in subtle forms. A patient refusing to be treated by her, a senior surgeon making offhand remarks about cultural differences, a nurse whispering something about how does she even see properly in that thing. Every comment chipped away at her, but she refused to let it break her. Instead, she doubled down on excellence. Each surgery she assisted, each diagnosis she made, became a quiet rebellion. Her reputation grew. The hijabi doctor who stayed calm under fire, the one who handled the toughest cases with grace. But fate had a strange way of weaving stories together. One afternoon, as she was preparing for another long shift, Amina received notice of a new emergency case. A car accident victim rushed in with severe internal injuries. She didn't think much of it at first. Emergencies were part of the job. But as she reviewed the file, her eyes caught the patient's name. A name she hadn't heard in years but could never forget. Ryan Matthews. The same boy who had once mocked her hijab, called her names in front of an entire classroom, and made her school years a quiet torment. The world seemed to still around her. For a moment, the sterile walls of the hospital faded, replaced by flashes of those painful memories. The laughter echoing through the hallway, the humiliation of walking away as everyone stared. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Now here he was, vulnerable, broken, and lying on a stretcher, completely unaware that the person about to save his life was the same girl he had tried to tear down. As she entered the trauma room, everything inside her felt suspended between two forces: resentment and duty. The monitors beeped steadily, the surgical team moved quickly, and at the center of it all was Ryan. Time had changed him. His hair thinner, his features harder, lines of age marking his face. But she recognized him instantly. She stood there for a moment, watching him as nurses prepped him for surgery. Part of her wanted to walk away, to let karma run its course. But another part, the part that had survived years of struggle without losing compassion, refused to stoop to hate. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rising above. She looked down at him, unconscious and fragile, and for the first time, she realized that power didn't come from humiliating someone who hurt you. It came from proving that you were never defined by their cruelty. When the surgery began, Amina led with precision. Every movement was deliberate, every decision made with clarity. The team followed her lead without hesitation. Hours passed in tense focus until finally, the operation was complete. Ryan's life was saved. As she stepped out of the operating room, exhaustion settled over her like a heavy blanket. She peeled off her gloves, looked at her reflection in the glass, and saw not just a doctor, but the girl she once was, transformed by struggle into something unbreakable. She had faced the boy who mocked her hijab, not with revenge, but with mastery, dignity, and grace. But fate wasn't done yet. The next morning, as she reviewed post-op charts, a nurse approached her and said that the patient had regained consciousness and was asking for the surgeon who operated on him. Amina froze. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the strange collision of past and present that now awaited her. She knew what was coming, the recognition, the shock, the disbelief. But she also knew that this was the moment her entire journey had been leading toward. With steady hands, she signed the final chart and began walking toward his recovery room. Each step echoed through the corridor, marking the distance between who she once was, a frightened girl mocked for her faith, and who she had become, the woman who now held the power to heal the very person who once broke her spirit. As she reached the door, she paused for a breath, her heart pounding with quiet strength. Then she pushed it open. Inside, Ryan Matthews lay awake, his eyes slowly turning toward her. And in that instant, the past came rushing back. But this time, Amina was the one standing tall. Years had passed since Amina last saw Dylan, the boy who once mocked her hijab, the classmate who had made her high school years a battlefield of shame and endurance. Life had taken them in drastically different directions, and she had long stopped thinking about him. Her world was filled with purpose now, late nights in the hospital, surgical rotations, and moments of quiet prayer before every operation. She had become everything she once dreamed of, a respected surgeon, known not only for her precision, but for the grace and compassion that guided every decision she made. But destiny has a way of writing stories that come full circle. That morning began like any other. The hospital was alive with urgency. The echo of footsteps, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the murmur of nurses exchanging information. Amina was scheduled for a complex cardiac procedure. A patient rushed in from an accident with multiple fractures and internal bleeding. She reviewed the report calmly, her trained eyes scanning the notes until one name stopped her breath cold. Dullan Matthews. The name felt like a whisper from another lifetime, a ghost of pain that had once defined her. She blinked, reading the name again, wondering if fate was playing some cruel trick. The file confirmed it: age, city, occupation, it was him. The same Dylan who had tormented her for wearing a hijab in school, who once laughed at her during lunch breaks, who called her names she tried to forget. And now, he was her patient. Amina's hands trembled slightly as she set the file down. Memories flooded back, of humiliation, of tears hidden in the school restroom, of the strength it took to walk back into that classroom the next day. She remembered her mother's words, reminding her that faith and patience were stronger than hate, that every cruelty she endured would one day become a stepping stone. And now those words echoed louder than ever. She walked into the operating room, her composure unshaken on the surface. The surgical lights glared overhead, illuminating the pale, unconscious face of the man who had once made her life unbearable. The irony was almost poetic. He had spent years looking down on her, and now he lay vulnerable beneath her hands, his life dependent on her skill and mercy. Her team prepared quickly, unaware of the personal history between surgeon and patient. Amina's focus sharpened. This was not about revenge. This was about professionalism, about proving that kindness and integrity triumph where hatred once festered. Still, a storm raged quietly inside her. As she scrubbed in, flashes of the past blended with the sterile present. She remembered standing outside the school gates, hearing laughter at her expense. She remembered the sting of cruel words, the whispers about her being different, foreign, oppressed. She remembered the loneliness that had once made her question her own strength. But that same pain had fueled her determination. It was what drove her to study longer, to push harder, to never let the world define her worth. And now, that very strength stood between life and death for the man who once tried to break her spirit. Hours passed in the operating room. Every incision was precise, every move guided by her steady hands. The monitors beeped rhythmically, marking the fragile thread of life she worked to preserve. Her team watched her with admiration. Her calm under pressure was almost spiritual. Inside her heart, though, there was a quiet conversation between forgiveness and justice. She didn't want him to die, not because she felt compassion for him, but because she wanted to prove, to herself and the universe, that she had risen far above his cruelty, that she had become everything he believed she could never be. When the final sutures were placed and the bleeding stopped, Amina stepped back. The surgery was a success. Dylan would live. As she removed her gloves and mask, she felt a strange peace settle over her. Not triumph, not revenge, something deeper. Closure. For years, she had carried the weight of that pain without realizing it. But now, seeing him there, powerless and unaware of who had saved him, she finally understood what it meant to move on. Later, as the team transferred Dylan to recovery, Amina stood outside the glass observation window, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. She thought about how easily the tables had turned. Once he had power through words, now she had power through mercy. And in that contrast lay the essence of justice. Not in retaliation, but in grace. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hospital skyline, Amina walked through the quiet corridors, her footsteps echoing softly. She paused at the window overlooking the city lights. Life had come full circle, and she felt gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the growth it forced upon her. But as she prepared to leave for the night, her phone buzzed with a message from the nurse on duty. Dylan was awake and asking to see the surgeon who saved his life. Amina froze, her breath catching. He didn't know who she was yet. He only knew her name from the chart, the same name he used to mock, the same name he turned into a punchline. Now, that name had saved him. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest. Part of her wanted to walk away, to let him live with the mystery. But another part knew that fate was giving her one last chance to confront the past. Not with anger, but with truth. She turned toward the recovery ward, her heart steady but heavy. As she approached the room, the faint sound of machines humming filled the air. She reached for the door handle, her reflection visible in the glass. A woman transformed by time, faith, and perseverance. And as the door creaked open, Dylan's eyes lifted from the bed, confused, weak, searching. Recognition flickered in them, faint but growing. Amina took a deep breath, stepping into the light. The room fell silent, and in that silence, the years between them dissolved into a single, powerful moment. The man who mocked her hijab now stared at the woman who had saved his life. And what she would do, or say, next would change everything. When the day of the surgery finally arrived, the hospital corridors carried an eerie stillness. Outside the operating theater, the family of the patient. Ethan, the man who had once ridiculed her for her hijab, waited anxiously. The irony of life had come full circle, and Dr. Amina could feel its weight pressing against her heart. She wasn't just about to perform a surgery, she was standing before the final test of her faith, her humanity, and her ability to rise above the prejudice that had once broken her spirit. The morning began early, the sun peeking through the hospital blinds as she reviewed Ethan's case file one final time. Years ago, he had laughed at her in a crowded classroom, mocking her accent, her hijab, and her dreams. Now, she was his only hope. His condition was severe. An accident had left him with internal bleeding and multiple complications. Any mistake could cost him his life. Amina stood before the mirror in the locker room, fastening her surgical gown. Beneath her cap, her scarf remained neatly pinned, a symbol of the faith and resilience that had guided her through every trial. She could almost hear the echoes of that cruel laughter from years ago, but they no longer hurt. They only reminded her of how far she had come. As she entered the operating room, the air was thick with tension. Her team awaited her orders, looking to her for direction and confidence. The lights above the table glared brightly, illuminating Ethan's pale face. For a moment, she froze not out of fear, but out of the realization that life had handed her the ultimate opportunity for revenge, yet she no longer craved it. The old wounds had healed, and in their place grew compassion. Stronger than bitterness, deeper than pride. The surgery began. The rhythmic sound of the heart monitor filled the room. Each movement of her hands was precise, steady, and guided by years of discipline and experience. Hours passed and exhaustion crept in, but she didn't waver. Every suture, every careful incision was a testament to her professionalism and her refusal to let hate define her. While she worked, fragments of memory floated through her mind. The years of struggle, the rejections, the whispers behind her back in medical school, the professors who doubted her intelligence, the patients who looked past her because of her hijab. Each one of those moments had led her here, sharpening her spirit instead of breaking it. She realized that forgiveness was not weakness, it was strength. And today she would prove that. The procedure was complex. There were moments when the patient's heart rate dropped, moments that tested every ounce of her training. But through it all, she kept her focus. Her team followed her lead, moving seamlessly under her calm authority. By the time the final suture was placed and the monitors stabilized, the weight in the room lifted. The surgery had been a success. When she finally stepped out of the operating room, sweat trickled down her temples beneath her hijab. Ethan's family rushed forward, desperate for answers. She informed them, with the same professional calm she gave all her patients, that the operation had gone well. Relief flooded their faces, tears streaming down their cheeks as they thanked her. They didn't know, of course, the history between them, the cruelty their loved one had once shown her, and she didn't need them to. Later, when Ethan awoke in his recovery room, the haze of anesthesia still clouding his vision, he found himself face to face with the surgeon who had saved him. At first, confusion flickered across his eyes. Then recognition dawned. The memory of the schoolyard, the mockery, the laughter, it all came rushing back. He saw her hijab, the same symbol he had mocked, and shame spread across his face. Amina didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was the answer to every insult, every cruel word he had ever thrown her way. Her success, her compassion, and her quiet dignity were louder than any lecture, more powerful than any revenge. She simply checked his vitals, ensured he was stable, and left the room in silence. Outside, the hospital hallway stretched long and quiet. For a moment, she leaned against the wall, allowing herself a deep breath. Years of pain, humiliation, and determination had come to this one moment of peace. She didn't feel triumph in the sense of victory over someone who had wronged her. Instead, she felt liberation. She had freed herself from the cycle of hate that had consumed so many others. Days later, Ethan requested to see her again before being discharged. Wordlessly, she entered his room, maintaining her calm, professional demeanor. He couldn't look her in the eyes at first. His voice was weak, his tone trembling with regret as he tried to express his gratitude. His words faltered, tangled with guilt, as he realized the depth of his past cruelty and the grace she had shown him now. She listened quietly, nodded once, and then wished him well in his recovery. For her, the chapter was closed. She had done her duty, not as the girl who had once been mocked, but as the doctor she had worked so hard to become. Months passed, and Amina continued to rise in her career. She was soon promoted to chief surgeon, her reputation spreading far beyond the hospital walls. Young women from all backgrounds looked up to her, inspired by her story, though few knew the full extent of what she had endured to reach that point. Sometimes she would pass by the old neighborhood where it all began. The school where she was ridiculed, the streets where people had stared. It no longer held the power it once did. Those places were simply memories, chapters in a story that had long since turned its final page. Meanwhile, Ethan's life took a different turn. The experience humbled him in ways nothing else could. He began volunteering at local clinics, speaking against prejudice, and sharing his story, how the woman he once mocked had saved his life. His transformation didn't erase his past, but it made his redemption meaningful. For Amina, there was no need to seek revenge. The universe had done that for her, not through punishment, but through justice wrapped in irony. She had become living proof that strength, faith, and kindness could outshine ignorance and cruelty. And so, the girl who was once laughed at for her hijab became a symbol of compassion and triumph. Her story spread quietly but powerfully, a reminder that true victory is not in revenge, but in rising above hate. As she stood one evening on the hospital rooftop, watching the sunset bathe the city in gold, she whispered a prayer of gratitude. For every insult that had shaped her resolve, for every hardship that had strengthened her heart, and for every moment that had led her here, to this peace. Her hijab fluttered gently in the wind, not as a target of mockery, but as a crown of dignity. And somewhere below, in the same city that had once scorned her, people whispered her name, not with laughter, but with respect.